the fastest economic growth in nearly 40 years. So clearly, and you heard the President of the United States talk about this in the State of the Union, inflation and costs are an issue that we will continue to focus. It's a top priority for him. But in terms of the strength and stability of the economy, we do feel we are continue to be positioned well to deal with the challenges ahead. Go ahead.
I wanted to ask on refugees, and
Sure.
obviously there's been about 2 million people, 2 million Ukrainians who have already left the country, and I know you've said from the podium that most will likely want to stay in the area in Eastern Europe, but I'm wondering what steps would the administration consider to take in more refugees now? I know some advocacy groups have talked about, for example, admitting Ukrainians who already have pending visa applications as refugees. Are there steps that the White House, the administration, would do now to admit more in the United States?
Well, there are steps which are not exactly related to refugees, but related to the Ukrainian population, including temporary protected status, which we announced and are granting for anyone who has been here since March 1st. In terms of additional steps, the reason why it's important to note that we think it's not just many, the vast majority of refugees we believe will want to stay in neighboring countries in Europe, where many of them have family, many of them have worked, many of them have friends and others. So that is our assessment. That is why we are continuing to provide humanitarian assistance to neighboring countries who are providing, who are welcoming refugees from Ukraine, who are providing them the assistance they need in this moment of time. And that's where we feel our efforts are best focused.
Jen, can I follow up?
Yeah.
On the refugees, President Duda today, when he was speaking to the Vice President, asked if the U.S. could speed up and simplify as soon as possible the procedures for Ukrainians who want to come to the United States because they have relatives here and they want to stay here until the war is over. So is that something that the United States is considering?
Ukrainians with neighboring countries continue to be that the best way that the United States can contribute to this refugee crisis is by providing humanitarian assistance, funding to a range of countries who are welcoming refugees. So that's where our focus has been.
And I also wanted to ask you about comments that Representative Madison Cawthorn made about the Ukrainian government. He said in a video that Zelensky is a thug. He said the Ukrainian government is incredibly corrupt. He said some other things, but he also said that Zelensky is pushing misinformation on America. Would the White House like to comment?
I would not. Go ahead.
The administration has talked a lot about waiting out short-term effects of sanctions on Russia, and so Americans might now naturally be wondering when the medium term might start. Do you have any indication at all yet that Putin is being squeezed by these sanctions, as you put it yesterday?
That any indication he is being squeezed?
Making a different decision. I mean, the messaging from the White House has been this is going to hurt, Russia's to blame. Just wait it out. What can you tell Americans who are like, well, when, how long? I mean, that's a natural question a lot would have.
Well, because of our efforts, the ruble is worth a penny. It's the lowest ranked currency in the world. The Russian stock market has not even opened. And you have seen in days, and you have seen outcry from a number of President Putin's buddies and cronies in the form of the oligarchs who we have also been squeezing. Our calculation has been that these financial sanctions and that we have rallied the world to support would have an impact. Our objective is, of course, to bring an end to this conflict. In terms of when that will happen, I'm unfortunately not in the mind of President Putin, but in terms of the impact on his financial sector, the response from people who are close to him, and frankly from the courageous outcry from thousands of people in Russia, that has been clear. When it will change his calculus, I can't give a prediction of that.
And can you talk to us a little bit about the president's engagement with senators who have met with his Supreme Court nominee, Judge Jackson? There are reports that he has made multiple calls to Senator Collins, for example. How is it going, and what is his level of engagement right now?
The president has been very closely engaged in this process, even while he is rallying the world to stand up against President Putin. He has made a range of calls over the course of time. I'm not going to confirm specifics of those from here. I would also note that Judge Jackson has been meeting with a range of members on the Hill, as you all have seen every day, including members who may not have had any record of voting for nominees of ours in the past, but she's committed to meeting with every member of the Judiciary Committee before her hearing, and she is quickly working through that. And she is also committed to meeting others beyond that period of time. And many of them have come out and spoken to her their meetings with her after that. So I think that gives the best assessment of how things are going quite well. Go ahead.
Thanks, Jen. This morning, a bipartisan group of lawmakers sent an open letter to the president asking to invoke the Defense Production Act to increase oil production. Is the administration considering a move like that, or other conversations with industry to help lower gas prices at the moment?
Well, without ruling out or ruling in any options, let me explain to you what the Defense Production Act would do in this regard. It would basically be providing money to oil companies to do something that they already probably have the capacity to do.
Have you been in conversation with these oil companies since this latest rise of gas prices has come to increase production?
We have been. We have had senior officials in touch with oil companies, yes.
Switching gears really quickly, on President Biden's conversation with the Colombian president today. As a strategic partner, in the latest talks with Venezuela, was Colombia involved in those talks about releasing Americans? And will further talks about releasing Americans from Venezuela be part of President Biden's conversation today?
I don't believe they were part of the conversation with Venezuelans, with Maduro about releasing Americans. I can certainly check on that front. We will, I'm sure, have a readout after the meeting that the president is having shortly.
And then on another migrant crisis, Colombia's obviously been dealing with their own migrant crisis coming out of Venezuela for years now. As part of these, as you've all said, that migration is going to be a major part of these conversations with Colombia, is the administration prepared to say, help the refugee crisis that's going on in that country and manage the outflow from Venezuela into Colombia?
Well, one, they have been a model. Colombia has in many ways in trying to take steps not only to welcome refugees, but also to crack down in many ways on migration. That's part of the conversation that the president will have. We have provided a range of assistance in the past, but I don't believe that there's a new assistance package coming today, but that has been part of our engagement with them in the past. Go ahead. Oh, sorry, did I skip you, Ed? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
In the readout of the call between the president and Turkey's President Erdogan, wrote that the president appreciated Turkey's effort to support a diplomatic resolution. How would you characterize the White House's role today in supporting a diplomatic resolution to the crisis, if there's any role the U.S. is playing?
The U.S. is leading the global effort to rally opposition to the actions of President Putin, and we have been engaged with the Ukrainians on a daily basis. We've provided more security assistance, more humanitarian assistance than any country in the world, and there wouldn't be the unity of financial sanctions and actions without the leadership of the United States. So what we're doing is we're putting the Ukrainians in a position of increasing, hopefully, strength in their negotiations and discussions.
Is the U.S. playing any concrete role in facilitating these diplomatic talks?
We are supporting the efforts by a range of leaders, including Erdogan, including our Turkish allies, including the Israelis, including the French, and others who are engaging directly with President Putin over this.
And if I could just ask a follow-up on inflation. You know, you've been getting questions about inflation for months.
Sure.
And you talked about a lot of work the White House is doing, but it's largely been long-term strategy, right? Supply chain work, supporting manufacturing in the U.S., semiconductors. To the Americans that woke up with another round of headlines about inflation this morning, is there something you want to point to that's what the White House is doing to provide short-term relief, like immediate relief to the rising costs?
I would say that a huge part of what we've done has had an impact already. One is obviously inflationary pressures have been caused by the pandemic, and getting the pandemic under control, which has been the president's top priority, has the biggest impact on that. We've seen hospitalizations go down. We've seen people return to the workplace. We've seen 99% of schools open across the country. Also, the steps that our supply chain task force have taken have already had an enormous impact, including increasing movement through ports by, I believe, about 60%. If you look at shelves at stores right now, 89% of them are stocked. That is a direct result of the actions of the supply chain task force and this president. It is also true that while the early stages of inflationary pressures were caused by the pandemic and caused by the impact on the supply chain of that right now what we're looking at are different pressures, right? Which is the pressure of the energy sector that is a direct result of President Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And what we are doing in that regard is leading the world in responding to that and looking at every option possible, including coordinating a coordinated release from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to ensure we're increasing supply to reduce prices. So I would say that there are a range of steps that have already had an enormous impact across the board on addressing inflationary pressures, but we also are dealing now with a new challenge that is why we're seeing the inflationary pressures go up. Go ahead.
Just to follow up on your point that you said that senior administration officials have been in touch with oil companies about boosting supply. I don't know unless this has been reported elsewhere. Can you say which ones and what the response is?
I'm not going to detail it further, but we've clearly met with them and remain engaged with them as we do with a range of private sector companies.
One other on Ukraine, we talked about chemical and biological weapons. As Russia appears to be moving towards encircling Kyiv itself, something that Pentagon officials, you or others have said could take several days, if not weeks. Is there concern about getting enough military equipment into Kyiv in advance of that? Or what would happen, what would be done to make sure that they can still be supplied if this encirclement happens or is underway?
Well, what we have been able to do to date is provide, even in the last 10 days since we announced this new package, about $240 to $250 million in military assistance, defensive assistance that, as we noted earlier in the briefing, is what our military has identified as most helpful to them in this moment. We also, thanks to the omnibus and the parts of many parts of that we do like, will now have about $13 billion in additional assistance, some of which we will be able to expedite and provide hopefully rather quickly. We have effectively and efficiently been able to provide a range of assistance to the Ukrainians, and we expect we'll be able to continue to do that.
And then there was a helpful but on background and off-camera conversation yesterday about the Colombia president's visit and details of the Venezuela engagement over the weekend. I wanted to clarify one or two things. One of the officials said that there were no talks between us and the regime. We traveled down there to secure the release of detained Americans and to urge a return to the negotiating table. So they did not speak with Maduro government officials about getting the Americans released?
Well, we were working to free American citizens. As I said yesterday, detained in Venezuela, obviously that required speaking with those who had detained them. I don't have more details on who exactly was engaged in that from the Venezuelan side.
You know, when was the last time U.S. officials had talked to anyone in the Maduro regime or that was holding those hostages before they went to Venezuela?
You mean before they were detained in Venezuela a couple of years ago?
Before they got there this weekend. When would
It had been ongoing for months.
Okay. So the timing of this visit, I know they said in the call, for example, this was the result of months of work. Was it prompted by what's going on in Ukraine, their visit? Or was it the result of unrelated months of work? Because there are some looking at this saying they're taking advantage of the Ukraine situation, potential vulnerability, the need for oil in the global supply, not just in the U.S., but globally. This must have been why they went this weekend.
Well, the issue of detainees is our first priority. And we are also, as you know, had discussions about a range of issues, even as they were through different channels. But I would note that there have also been developments, including Maduro committing to engage with talks with the opposition that have happened over the last couple of days. But the release of the detainees was not for the exchange for sanctions relief or buying oil. And as I noted a little bit earlier in the briefing, this is not currently an active, while they are a very large producer of oil, this is not currently at this moment an active conversation about importing their oil. So that's where things stand at this point in time. But obviously when there's opportunity to bring American citizens who are detained home, we are going to take advantage of that opportunity.
Can I follow up on that?
Yeah.
On the timing of these meetings with Nicolás Maduro, when did these meetings actually start?
You
When
mean
was the first time that there was an engagement between the U.S. government and Nicolás Maduro?
Well, the engagements with those who have been detaining Americans have been ongoing for months.
But can you be a little bit more specific?
I can see if
on
there's
the
anything more specific I can get you, sure.
And also following on that, since the president is already here, I mean, in Washington, D.C., the president of Colombia,
Yeah.
Iván Duque, and about to meet with President Biden, was there any courtesy call from the U.S. regarding this engagement with Nicolás Maduro, given the circumstances and given that President Duque has been one of the most vocal critics in the region against Nicolás Maduro?
I'm happy to check and see if there's any more details we can provide on our diplomatic engagements. I would note that our objective here and our top priority was bringing American citizens home. Typically, those conversations and the briefing out of them.
Colombia as a principal extra NATO ally after the meeting with the president or even prior to?
Sure. Let's let the meeting happen. We will have a readout of the meeting after the meeting, and I'm sure there will be some developments coming out of it. Go ahead.
Can I follow up on the vote that took out the COVID funding? Well, obviously, one of the issues that rose with the Democrats in the House was the offsets. Was the White House on board with that arrangement, with taking sort of half of that funding from the pre-existing funds, and is that something that would be workable in a standalone piece of legislation?
I'm just not going to negotiate on this from here. Our objective is to ensure that there is additional funding so that we can continue to meet the needs of the American people. As I noted earlier, those conversations are ongoing, when we will certainly be a part of them from here in our legislative team.
And one more on gas prices. I know you've spoken, I think, about the gas tax before, but there was a group of Democratic governors who wrote a letter to congressional leadership about a potential federal gas tax holiday, something that the president would engage Congress on?
We have not taken any options off the table, and including that one. I would just note that the gas tax, if I'm correct here, is about 18 cents. And obviously gas has gone up by a larger amount than that. So we will consider a range of options, but the biggest impact we believe we can have is working through a range of channels to increase supply in the global marketplace, and that is where a lot of our energies are focused on, but we have not taken options off the table. Go ahead.
Thanks, Jen. I wanted to follow up on something you said earlier about how the U.S. is supporting the diplomatic talks between Ukraine and Russia, but has there been conversations about America getting more involved, and is there a point where President Biden needs to bring both sides to the table?
Well, I would say that what our biggest focus is on is continuing to support the Ukrainians, the Ukrainian leaders, and we are doing that by being the largest provider of military, security assistance, and humanitarian assistance in the world. And our objective is to strengthen them, boost them as they are participating in these negotiations. I have not, the president has never closed the door to diplomacy. Certainly he has been leading the diplomatic effort largely around the world as we're rallying opposition to President Putin's efforts. But we've also been engaging before and after nearly every one of these conversations with the Ukrainians, with the Europeans, to discuss where we can support and get readouts of all of these conversations.
And one more. Former Vice President Mike Pence was at the Ukrainian border today. Did the administration know he was going, and was there any kind of State Department support for him or any kind of official support?
I'm certainly happy to check. April, why don't you do the last one? Go ahead.
Okay, Jen, two questions. One, I want to find out what's the latest on Brittany Griner, if you have an update, and also what is the end goal when it comes to this situation for the Biden administration?
The end goal of the war.
Resolution for Brittany Griner in the midst of all of this.
Well, we have of course seen the reports. I cannot speak to the specifics of it because we do not have a Privacy Act waiver. But our objective is always to bring American citizens home who are detained in foreign countries. So that will remain our focus, and that's what we'd like to see the end outcome to be.
Is this Putin's bargaining chip? Is she Putin's bargaining chip?
Again, I can't speak to the specifics of this case, April. I certainly understand why you're asking, but our focus right now on our how we're going to bring an end to the conflict is to support and boost up the Ukrainians, to support diplomatic conversations, and to continue to provide a range of assistance in that light.
Speak to specifically why she's detained, all of that, but the end result, can you get into a little bit of the weeds, the minutia, as to what you're doing and how to bring her back?
I cannot speak to that from here. We don't have a Privacy Act waiver, I would say again, but also for any American citizen held, we typically do not get into specifics because that is not constructive to bringing people home.
And lastly, can you preview tomorrow as the president, he laid out the next year during the State of the Union, but he's going to be talking to his own party tomorrow in Philly. What can you give us a little bit of a readout of what he's going to say specifically? I'm trying to get a little bit more as it relates to the CBC. What is he going to say to them? Because he didn't have as much equity and inclusion in the State of the Union as some would have hoped for.
Well, I would say I have not reviewed the remarks with him yet, or the remarks yet, so I am not in a position yet to give you a preview of what he's going to say. He's looking forward to traveling to Philadelphia tomorrow to speak with the caucus. I'm sure we can get you all something on that later this afternoon. Thanks, everyone.
What's your end game in Ukraine? What's your end game there? You're not facilitating negotiation, you're not going there. I know.
Negotiators from both sides are holding talks in Belarus. This offers a ray of hope. We pray that these talks will calm down tempers and pave way to peace. Excellencies, dear colleagues, the General Assembly, with its 193 member states, represents the collective conscience of humanity. The strength of this assembly is rooted in its moral authority. Let us demonstrate that moral courage and use today's debate not to whip up rhetoric, not to whip up war rhetoric, but to give peace a chance. Let us ignite the fire of love, humanity, compassion, and hope. Guns are better off when noted. Let peace prevail. I thank you. I now give the floor to the Secretary General of the United Nations, His Excellency Antonio Guterres.
Mr. President of the General Assembly, Excellencies, the fighting in Ukraine must stop. It's raging across the country from air, land, and sea. It must stop now. Russian missile and air bombardments have been pounding Ukrainian cities day and night. The capital, Kyiv, is encircled from all sides. In the face of the continuing attacks, Kyiv's 3 million residents are being forced to seek safety in their homes, improvised bomb shelters, and the city's subways. The Ukrainian government has distributed a meaningful number of arms to the population with the stated objective to participate in the defense of the country. According to UNHCR, 500,000 Ukrainians have fled across the country's borders. Although Russian strikes are reportedly largely targeting Ukrainian military facilities, we have credible accounts of residential buildings, critical civilian infrastructure, and other non-military targets sustaining heavy damage. This escalating violence, which is resulting in civilian deaths, including children, is totally unacceptable. Enough is enough. Soldiers need to move back to their barracks, and leaders need to move to peace. Civilians must be protected. International humanitarian and human rights law must be upheld. The sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders must be respected, in line with General Assembly resolutions. Mr. President, we are facing a tragedy for Ukraine but also a major regional crisis with potentially disastrous implications for us all. Yesterday, Russian nuclear forces were put on high alert. This is a chilling development. The mere idea of a nuclear conflict is simply inconceivable. Nothing can justify the use of nuclear weapons. Mr. President, we face what could easily become Europe's worst humanitarian and refugee crisis in decades, with the numbers of refugees and internally displaced multiplying by the minute. I am grateful for the compassion, generosity and solidarity of Ukraine's neighbors who are taking in those seeking safety. It is important that this solidarity is extended without any discrimination based on race, religion or ethnicity. The neighboring countries will need all our support in the days and weeks to come. The United Nations will continue to assist with these efforts. Mr. President, on Saturday, I spoke with President Zelensky and assured him that the United Nations would not abandon the Ukrainian people and conveyed our determination to enhance humanitarian assistance. Even before the events of the past week, the UN was providing some 3 million people on both sides of the contact line with humanitarian assistance. The United Nations is now working 24/7 to access humanitarian needs and scale up the delivery of life-saving support to many more people desperate for protection and shelter, particularly women and children, elderly people, and those with disabilities. We are fully committed to staying and delivering for everyone affected by this deadly conflict across the country. Some of our personnel are expanding existing programs, and others are preparing new operations to get help to those who need it fast. I want to highlight 3 concrete actions. First, I've allocated $20 million from the Central Emergency Response Fund to support emergency operations along the contact line in the eastern oblasts of Donetsk and Luhansk and in other parts of the country. These will allow us to help more vulnerable people get the basics, shelter, food, water and health care as soon as possible. Second, I have appointed Amin Awad as the UN Crisis Coordinator for Ukraine. He will liaise with the government and with all relevant actors on the ground, supported by the resident humanitarian coordinator and the UN country team. At the same time, we are bringing together partners in and outside the country and surging personnel into the country. Third, tomorrow we will launch 2 coordinated emergency appeals for Ukraine and the region. One that addresses escalating humanitarian needs inside the country, including rising internal displacement, and another that responds to the needs of people crossing international borders to seek refuge in countries neighboring Ukraine. As we ramp up our efforts, it is essential that the safety and security of UN and associated personnel in Ukraine are protected in accordance with international law, and that humanitarian access to vulnerable people and communities is guaranteed. I call on all sides to uphold their obligations to allow freedom of movement of humanitarian personnel and to facilitate safe, rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief. I also urge the international community to mobilize in support of our funding appeals to address the needs of all those displaced by this crisis, as well as other vulnerable groups whose numbers will only grow as the fighting escalates. Mr. President, humanitarian aid is vital, but it is not a solution. It is simply treating the worst impacts of the conflict. The only true solution is peace. The attack on Ukraine challenges international law and the multilateral system rooted in the UN Charter. Some of the possible consequences of a worsening conflict are terrifying to contemplate. Regional tensions are rising. The latest security measures underline the high stakes for all. The economic repercussions of the crisis will have widespread impact, and I count on every member state to live up to the principles of the Charter. Mr. President, the guns are talking now, but the path of dialogue must always remain open. It's never too late to engage in good faith negotiations and to address all issues peacefully. I hope that the direct talks now taking place between Ukrainian and Russian delegations will produce not only an immediate halt to the fighting, but also a path towards a diplomatic solution. I welcome and encourage all peaceful efforts to end the bloodshed and halt this conflict. I thank the countries who have offered to host and facilitate negotiations. The United Nations is ready to support such efforts. Mr. President, war is not the answer. It is death, human suffering, senseless destruction, and an immense distraction from the real challenges facing humanity. The climate crisis and biodiversity loss, vitally needed socio-economic recovery from the pandemic, healing the divides of race and gender, and so many other pressing 21st century challenges. Humanity cannot afford to be locked in a mindset that dredges up the worst of past centuries. We need to look forward as United Nations to overcome the scourge of war. We need to focus on solving problems, not making them worse. In cities around the world, people are taking to the streets and demanding an end to war. People in Ukraine want and need peace. And I believe people in the Russian Federation do too. We need peace now. Thank you.
I thank the Secretary General for his statement. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ukraine.
Mr. President, Secretary General, for the first time since the United Nations was born, there is a full-fledged war in the center of Europe. Everyone in this hall and everyone in the world knows that Russia, and Russia alone, started this invasion now facilitated by Belarus. This war was not provoked. It was chosen by someone who is right now sitting in the bunker. We know what happened with the person who sat in the bunker in Berlin in May 1945. Before I continue with my formal statement, I would like to switch to Russian and invite you to put on the headphones, because I would like to read from the screenshot of the smartphone of a killed Russian soldier. That's an actual screenshot from someone who is dead already.
Alyosha, how are you doing? Why has it been so long since you responded? Are you really in training exercises? Asks the mother of the killed soldier, moments before he was killed. Mama, I'm no longer in Crimea. I'm not in training sessions. Where are you then? Papa is asking whether I can send you a parcel. What kind of a parcel, Mama, can you send me? What are you talking about? What happened? Mama, I'm in Ukraine. There is a real war raging here. I'm afraid. We are bombing all of the cities together, even targeting civilians. We were told that they would welcome us, and they are falling under our armored vehicles, throwing themselves under the wheels and not allowing us to pass. They call us fascists. Mama, this is so hard. And this was several moments before he was killed.
Imagine, if you want to just visualize the magnitude of the tragedy, you have to imagine next to you, next to every nameplate of every single country in this General Assembly, more than 30 souls of killed Russian soldiers already. Next to every name of every single country in this assembly, 30 plus killed Russian soldiers. Hundreds of killed Ukrainians. Dozens of killed children. And it goes on and on and on. So just imagine those killed people next to you when you will listen to my formal statement. Big militarized powers seeking for geopolitical greatness has launched a full-fledged military offensive against a smaller neighbor aimed at invading the country. Deadly airstrikes dropped on civilians' heads across the entire country, and the Russian troops crossed Ukraine's borders from the territory of Russia, Belarus, and the occupied parts of Ukraine's Donbas and Crimea. Does it remind you of something, doesn't it? Indeed. Very clear parallels could be drawn with the beginning of the Second World War, too. And Russia's course of action is very similar to what their spiritual mentors from the Third Reich employed on the Ukrainian land 80 years ago. Just the most recent example of human sufferings, example of war crime. As all of us were on our way to the General Assembly today, the Russian army shelled with Grad multiple rocket launcher systems the residential areas of the city of Kharkiv, the second biggest in Ukraine. Innocent civilians have been killed and wounded. The exact numbers is very difficult to estimate because of the warfare, while the negotiations are still underway at the border with Belarus. We therefore express our gratitude for overwhelming support that made this decision on the emergency session possible. We are grateful to the President of the General Assembly for his taking care of this idea well in advance. We appreciate the engagement of the UN Secretary General, who has taken a very strong stance in support of peace, in support of the UN Charter. We have been prompted to call for an emergency special session as the level of the threat to the global security has been equated to that of the Second World War, or even higher, following Putin's order to put and alert Russian nuclear forces. What a madness. If he wants to kill himself, he doesn't need to use nuclear arsenal. He has to do what the guy in Berlin did in a bunker in May 1945. The Security Council addressed the issue of the Russian war against Ukraine, and the decision was not adopted due to the obvious reason. The country attempting to occupy Ukraine since 2014 has occupied the seat of the Council permanent member since 1991. Therefore, we do not accept the Russian logic that the Security Council was unable to act due to one-sided and unbalanced approach. The only guilty party is the Russian Federation. Distinguished delegates, Russia uses all its military potential to attack Ukraine and has begun redeploying reserve units on the border with Ukraine. It fires cruise and ballistic missiles at cities, attacks with aviation, tanks and artillery, sends subversion and reconnaissance groups which mark residential buildings in preparation for the air attacks. Russia's missiles are now aimed at destroying the infrastructure objects. They targeted the radioactive waste disposal site near Kyiv, the fuel base in the town of Vasilkiv, that is effectively a Kyiv's suburb. The objects of logistic infrastructure, including bridges, airports, and water reservoirs, remain among the targets. Such towns as Chester and Stanitsa Luganska near Lugansk are now nearly destroyed, as well as residential buildings in and around Kyiv and Kharkiv. The Russian forces seized the Chernobyl nuclear power station and the part of southern Kherson region, including the North Crimean Canal. Due to the active moving of Russian heavy militaries through the Chernobyl exclusion zone, the radiation level has increased rapidly. In the Black Sea, Russian warships deliberately attacked two civil vessels under the flags of Panama and Moldova, approaching Ukraine. This constitutes a flagrant violation of the international law of the sea. Incredibly, one of the vessels had the Russian crew. Still, it was attacked by the Russians. Russians keep attacking kindergartens and orphanages, thus committing war crimes and violating the Rome Statute. Hospitals and mobile medical aid brigades are also targeted by the Russian shelling and the sabotage groups working in Ukraine's cities and towns. The Russian military fired on ambulance crews in the areas of Zaporizhia and Kyiv. In Akhtirka district of Sumy region, Russian tanks shot down a bus with civilians. Later, the Russian military did not allow ambulances on the spot. As of today, 352 people, including 16 children, were killed on the Ukrainian side, and 2,040 Ukrainians, including 45 children, wounded during the first 5 days of the Russian invasion. And this number is growing non-stop. I have already told about the morning shellings in Kharkiv, and we cannot really estimate at this moment how many were killed. In response, Ukraine has activated its right for self-defense according to the Article 51 of the UN Charter. The Russian troops are suffering losses: aircrafts, helicopters, tanks, trucks, personnel. The aggressor forces have already lost more than 5,000 in manpower during the first days of aggression. Excellencies, the General Assembly should be vocal in demanding from the Russian Federation to stop its offensive against Ukraine. In recognizing Russian actions as an act of aggression against a sovereign and independent state, in demanding from Russia to immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw its forces from the territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders, in demanding from the Russian Federation to reverse the decision related to the status of certain areas of Donetsk and Lugansk regions of Ukraine, in demanding full compliance with the provisions of international humanitarian law. The General Assembly should also be clear with regard to the treacherous role of Belarus and its involvement in aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine. Distinguished members of the General Assembly, what is happening now in Ukraine has already had the security and humanitarian implications for all of you. Immediately for Europe, a bit later for the rest, including in terms of food security, energy security, financial markets, collapse of the economies. Last September, my president said, while delivering his statement at the high-level segment of the 76th session of the General Assembly, and I quote, "I understand that criticism of the UN is often heard, but we criticize ourselves." End of quote. If we fail to respond now, we will face much more than criticism. We will face oblivion. It must not happen. Now it is time to act, time to help Ukraine, that is paying now the ultimate price for freedom and security of itself and of the world. If Ukraine does not survive, international peace will not survive. If Ukraine does not survive, the United Nations will not survive. Have no illusions. If Ukraine does not survive, we cannot be surprised if democracy fails next. Now we can save Ukraine, save the United Nations, save democracy, and defend the values we believe in and that Ukrainians are fighting for and paying with their lives. The Russian delegate will speak shortly. Putin has done everything to delegitimize the Russian presence in the United Nations. But I wonder if the Russian presence in the United Nations has ever been legitimate. I wonder if ever this assembly voted in accordance with paragraph 2 of Article 4 on admission of the Russian Federation to the United Nations, either in December 1991 or in January 1992, or wherever thereafter. I want to ask the delegates whose countries voted for admission of the Russian delegation to the United Nations to raise their hand, to confirm that Russia was admitted to the United Nations according to the Charter. Please, gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, please raise your hand if your country voted in the formal session of the General Assembly in reply to the letter by President Yeltsin dated December 24, 1991, when he told the United Nations that Russia would like to be a continuator state of the demised Soviet Union. Anyone? Shall I put my glasses if my vision fails me and I don't see any hand raised? Any country? Anyone voted for Russian membership? I leave you with that and think about it when you listen to the Russian delegate.
I thank the distinguished representative of Ukraine. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, distinguished colleagues, in recent days, the Ukrainian issue has made headlines, global headlines, and has now been given pride of place at the UN Security Council and now the General Assembly. At the same time, Russian actions are being distorted and thwarted, and there is the number of incredible fakes is staggering with the use with media outlets and social networks proliferating these lies. For this reason, today I wish to focus on the real reasons for the crisis that has emerged and its possible consequences. I wish to emphasize the following. The root for the current crisis lies in the actions of Ukraine itself. For many years, it sabotaged and flouted its direct obligations under the Minsk package of measures. Just recently, very recently, there was a hope that in Kiev they would reconsider and that they would indeed comply with what they signed on to back in 2015. For that, first and foremost, what was necessary was direct dialogue, as set out in the document, between Donetsk and Lugansk. However, the latest confirmation from the senior leadership of the country was that Ukraine was unwilling to engage in this dialogue, and they took unwilling to take steps to grant special status to Donbass, as set out in the Minsk agreements, and this was actively supported by the Western patrons of Kiev. And this definitively persuaded us of the fact that we no longer have a right to allow the residents of Donbass to suffer any further. Insofar as Ukrainian provocations against the people of Donbass in February did not end, in fact, they escalated. The leadership of DPR and LPR turned to us with a request to deliver military support in line with bilateral agreements on cooperation, which were arrived at with their recognition, concurrently with recognition, and this was a logical step to the ongoing, the persistent aggressive actions undertaken by the Ukrainian regime. The Ukrainian authorities, which has of late been actively armed and incited by a number of states, were under the misconception that with the indulgence of Western patrons and sponsors, they would be able to address the issues in Donbass militarily. It is difficult otherwise. It would be difficult to explain the ongoing intensification of shelling and sabotage acts on the territory of the republics, which I mentioned. The people of Donbass and Lugansk continued to have to take shelter in basements. There was a flood of refugees entering the Russian Federation, and yet still the nature of the Ukrainian armed forces operation did not change, and yet Western partners did not turned a blind eye to this, and they merely echoed Ukrainian tall tales about the allegations that Donbass people were shelling on themselves. The worsening suffering of the residents of Donbass is something that has left Western sponsors unmoved in recent years. This discussion at the Security Council and General Assembly, there was no empathy whatsoever, no compassion for the people of Donbass and Lugansk. It seems that these 4 million people simply don't exist for them. And as a result, the ongoing threats targeting the people of LPR and DPR, given the lack of prospects for addressing the problems in the area under the Minsk operations due to the failure to fulfill them, the Russian president took a decision for a special military operation to be carried out in Donbass. Occupation of Ukraine is not part of these plans. The goal of the special operation is to protect the people who for 8 years were subject to torment and genocide by the Kiev regime. To that end, there's a need to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. We further will strive to hold accountable those who carried out countless brutal crimes against the people, the residents, including residents of the Russian Federation. This decision was taken in line with Article 51 of the United Nations Charter with the sanction of the Federation Council of the Russian Federation. In pursuant of the Agreement on Friendship and Cooperation with DPR and LPR, I wish to recall further that the principle of sovereignty and territorial integrity of states is something which we are being accused of breaching vis-a-vis Ukraine. The Declaration on Principles of International Law on Friendly Relations Between Peoples was adopted in 1970, and it needs to be unstintingly complied with respect to states, I quote, conducting themselves in compliance with the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples as described above, and thus possessed of a government representing the whole people, belonging to the territory without distinction as to race, creed, or color. End of quote. Today's government of Ukraine is no such government. Moreover, during the special military operation, Russia has been exercising its right to self-defense from a regime that has been striving to gain access to nuclear weapons. The president of Ukraine explicitly stated this on 18 February during the Munich conference, and I would recall, this statement that he delivered was met with applause by the participants of this conference. At the same time, Ukraine is seeking membership in NATO, where there's Article 5 in effect, and has territorial claims to the Russian Federation. Hence, by leveraging Article 51 of the UN Charter, not only is Russia protecting itself from the nationalist threat, but Russia is also seeking to uphold the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter on the soil of Donbass and Ukraine, ensuring that the main goal of the United Nations be upheld, namely to prevent succeeding generations from a scourge of war. Unfortunately, it behooves us to note the very negative role played in all of this by Western colleagues led by the United States. Instead of compelling Kiev to comply with its obligations, instead they are merely inciting Kiev, egging it on, repeating the senseless mantra that their obligations and the Minsk agreements are not being complied with the Russian Federation, which I should like to recall and emphasize, the Russian Federation is not a party to it. Moreover, our Western colleagues have shamelessly inundated the country with weapons, have sent to the country instructors, and effectively incited Ukrainians who are facing a 120,000-strong military contingent, prompted them to engage in armed provocation against the Donbass. Thereby, the Western countries have created a bubble that cannot but pop. Distinguished colleagues, discussing today, in this discussion, it behooves us to note that back in 2008, a Russian president at the NATO Bucharest Council cautioned that members of NATO should think 3 times before proudly stating that Ukraine and Georgia will join NATO, and this was portrayed as some kind of a great compromise, which was immediately met with action plans undertaken in Ukraine and Georgia to join the alliance. At the same time, in 2014, there was a brutal anti-constitutional coup which took place in Kiev, as a result of which nationalists and radicals seized power. And their policy was to create an anti-Russia in Ukraine and to ensure that it join NATO. And I will revisit that. For us, Ukraine joining NATO is a red line. First and foremost, from the military strategic level, the deployment of NATO infrastructure in that country would compel us to adopt measures in response, and this has placed us at the verge of conflict. For this reason, in December 2021, we proposed that agreements be arrived at with the U.S. and NATO for security assurances to be provided to the Russian Federation. However, our extended hand was unceremoniously rebuffed by Americans and NATO representatives. It was proposed that we continue to discuss secondary issues without consideration of our concerns. Moreover, the question was not addressed as to how the freedom of choosing alliances as set out in the OSCE aligns with the principles of indivisibility of security, which is of great importance to us. Probably many of you wonder what should be done now and what role can the United Nations play in